Hello again, and welcome to our Sunday morning Bible study with the Manchester Church of Christ. We are going to continue our study this morning through the book of 1 Peter. We are getting closer to the end. Next week, Lord willing, we will wrap up this study and then kind of assess where we're at and see where we are as a congregation, whether this will be needed or not, as we get closer to transitioning to something that I think all of us are looking forward to, which is being able to be together. In the meantime, I do hope this study has been profitable for you. I hope it's been helpful for you. More importantly, I hope you're doing well. It is my hope and prayer that all of us can come through this safely, that we can eliminate some of the struggles that we may be having in various ways, and again, that we can just proceed in a way that's healthy for everyone. Today, again, we're going to continue our study through 1 Peter, and we're going to start in chapter 4 and verse 12, and continue into the first few verses of chapter 5 as well. As Peter continues his thought on suffering, as he has been doing throughout really the entire book, the entire study of 1 Peter, this idea of suffering continues to be in Peter's mind. He continues to deal with this subject. And the reason for that is simply his audience was going to need it. They were going to face suffering. They were going to face trials. And for that reason, Peter dealt with this subject in a way, again, that would be helpful, informational, give them information that they needed to act in the best way, again, factoring in who they were as Christians. And so continuing that study and that understanding of what does it mean in the midst of suffering as a Christian, there's a very practical question that we need to ask that I think will be helpful to ask before we even look at this study. And again, our idea is to understand this first and foremost in Peter's letter, but at the same time to think about the applications to our own lives as Christians today, as again, we deal with various things as well. And the question is this: what should I expect in the Christian life? Let me say that one more time. What should I expect living a Christian life? Now, as you know, expectations are very important. When our expectations are wrong about something, we set ourselves up for a number of difficulties. Even when our expectations are right, that doesn't always mean that things will be pleasant, but at least there are other troubles that we don't necessarily have to worry about when our expectations are not what they should be. Now, I want you to think about this, again, more in your own lives right now. And here's where we bring it back to ourselves just a little bit, the practical side of being a Christian today. What are some of the difficulties or problems that we could face if our expectations about God and Christianity were not accurate, at least as portrayed in the Bible for the true God? You've probably seen some. Maybe you've felt some. I know in ministry I have seen a number of times where individuals just didn't understand something, and a lot of that stemmed from the fact that their understanding, their expectations of God just didn't fit what they saw happening in front of them. And so this idea of how does this fit together? How does this work? I don't get it. Now you can probably imagine where some of those thoughts can go. For some, there may be a temptation to give up on God completely. The idea of, if this is Christianity, if this is who God is, and God would allow me to go through this, or God would allow a loved one to suffer like this, that's not the God that I thought I followed. Now that can be a very serious thought. But as you're probably aware, it's also common. And it's hard. It's unbelievably difficult to see someone or experience something in a way that you just cannot imagine the God of the Bible, the God who sent Jesus to die on the cross could possibly allow one of his children to go through something like that. That can shake someone's faith. That can cause them to walk away and simply say, that's not the God that I want to follow. Sometimes it's just miserable to be caught off guard. Again, something happens and it's completely unexpected. We never thought it could happen even. It's just a time of misery. It's a time of difficulty. And again, it's not really pleasant for anyone going through a situation like that. The other side of that is if our expectations and understandings are wrong, we can easily portray a God that doesn't actually exist. We can tell others about the certain God who would do this and this and this, and then it's possible that if our statements were wrong, that someone else is going to experience something. And again, the question continues. That's not the God that I thought I was following. So what should I expect in the Christian life? Very important question for us to ask. Very important question for us to understand. In ministry, I cannot tell you, or even especially in Bible classes that I've taught and led, I cannot even count the amount of times I have heard questions that start similar to this, or statements that start similar to this. I can't believe that God would, and you fill in the blank. It's usually followed by the word allow, but nonetheless, a very trying situation happened to somebody that they weren't expecting. So I'm going to go ahead and read the remainder of chapter 4, where we continued off from last week, and you're going to see a statement that attacks that idea head on from Peter initially, and then he elaborates on that. So starting in verse 12 of chapter 4, reading from 1 Peter, Peter writes, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice, insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinners? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good." Peter starts immediately, "Beloved, do not be surprised." And again, we're in the context of suffering. What Peter's trying to say is suffering should be expected. Now that kind of sounds odd to us. And I want to start with our perspectives a little bit today that I hear, that I see, and that I may even think myself, and then work our way back into Peter's writing. But when you look at modern thought, it's almost the idea that suffering is abnormal, that we're surprised when it happens, and we almost act as if it should be avoided at all costs. Well, when we think about that idea, and if we start to conclude in our minds something like, we need to get through this suffering so that I can get back to normal life, we kind of have that backwards. And I'm speaking of suffering in a very generic way right now. Peter's using it in a very specific way. We'll get to that. But we kind of have that backwards. Because even though we may be surprised at the specifics of suffering, like I didn't expect this specific thing to happen, the reality is that suffering is a part of normal life. It's a part of our world that we live in. We see it all the time. We're around it constantly. It's a temporary world. We have temporary bodies, and those temporary bodies break down. Through all that we're going through right now, I haven't been able to do some of the exercising that I typically enjoy doing, that I try to do just because my schedule is completely different with all the COVID situation that's happening. But I was able to get out and stay in and do a pretty good workout yesterday. You know what? I'm sore. I hurt. Why? Because I have a temporary body that hurts when it goes through something that it's not used to going through. Every day we have reminders that suffering in some sense is simply a part of our life. Now, even though this may not make the specific situation easier, the expectation that misfortune should be expected to some degree in life, maybe it makes it a little more bearable. If our picture of normal life is, suffering's going to happen. Troubles will come and the unexpected will take place. Does it make those instances easy? Absolutely not. Is there still hurt? Absolutely. But at least my understanding and overall picture gives me a foundation that allows me to possibly go through it in a way that's better, healthier for me. Now, we started with our society today. What Peter's talking about is much more direct. Peter again comes back to these fiery trials that he's already illustrated and already showed us that this is because of their Christianity. These aren't just regular suffering examples that all people go through. These are trials that are coming directly from their Christianity. Now I want you to realize something that's very different from what we have today in America, at least in the society where I live, where I'm videotaping this from, and what Peter's audience faced. Our society has not drawn a line and said, if you are a Christian, you are on that side of the line, and therefore there are consequences for that. Our society hasn't done that. In some instances, that's what Peter's society was doing. Not everywhere, not with everyone, but it was going to be a part of some of their lives. And that should cause us to kind of ask ourselves the question, if that line was drawn, where would you stand? Would you step over to the side with Christ? That meant fiery trials. Questions about how I even function in my daily life. Would you be willing to cross over to that line? Peter's audience, some of them, were put in that position. And no doubt, because we see this in Peter's writings, we see this to a degree in Paul's writings, we see this in large part in the book of Revelation as well, this idea of whether or not we compromise in those situations. We know that was going to be something that early Christians struggled with. Some were going to remain strong and some were going to compromise. We know it's a reality. I think Peter will get to that just a little bit further down the line. But he goes on and talks about, again, after talking about these fiery trials, when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening, he's saying it's not strange, it's nothing new. But he gives the contrary. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you also may rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. So again, he gives them two distinct reasons to rejoice. First of all, it's illustrating their connection to Christ, which he's gone over abundantly to this part of the letter. And second, there's the reality that this is temporary. He talks about when something else is revealed, when his glory is revealed. So in other words, as hard as this may be, it is temporary. And when you take the full picture of something, you're going to be blessed by enduring this at this time. Now, verse 14 has an interesting statement here. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed. I don't think we quite grasp what Peter's saying there, or at least if we think about the term insult in the way that we commonly use it, we know how we give insults to one another, and it's kind of a personal attack typically, but that's all that it is, and they're not fun, and they hurt sometimes. But I don't think that's what Peter's getting at here. I don't think he's talking about a personal issue. Instead, we have to look at this as almost the idea of shame. Now, in a society that is built on kind of an honor-shame framework, that's much different. To be shamed had societal ramifications. People would look at you and not only look at you in a certain way, but treat you differently for that. So when he's talking about insults, I think we're doing much more than somebody saying something to our face or saying something about us on social media or insulting us in that way. I think it's a lot more serious than what that is. And again, that's not minimizing those things. I just want us to see what Peter is trying to address here. But then he goes on, but let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer as a meddler. And again, I think he's looking at how they respond. Do not allow yourselves to go through unnecessary suffering because you're responding in a certain way, because you're acting out in ways that Peter has already made it very clear. Don't act that way. But instead, again, the contrast is suffering for righteousness. Okay, deal with it. Recognize it in some way, as Peter's saying, as a blessing, but do not respond in a way that makes you an evildoer, and then you suffer for that as well. And at the end of this chapter, he has a statement that's kind of odd in verse 17. For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will the outcome for those who do not obey? What will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? Okay, interesting statement. And when we think about judgment, it's easy for us to think about the last day. It's easy for us to think about the very end. And if that's the case, this sounds kind of strange because as Christians, we have all these things like hope, assurance in our salvation because we are tied to Christ. And so the idea of judgment starting at the household of God seems kind of, again, strange. What I think Peter's doing here is kind of validating a Jewish belief of the time that we see in writings historically, where this idea is that judgment would kind of begin with God's own people. Now, how we understand that is, I think, summed up well by what many call eschatological judgment. And I think that's what Peter's getting at here. Now, if you haven't heard that word before, that's just a word. Eschatology is the study of last things. It deals with last things, historically, biblically. However, as we've already seen in Peter's letter before this, when he dealt with the end is near, I don't think he means the last day is coming. I think he means this is the last time period. And so when you look at it this way, this judgment is in association with the very last time period. And I think that makes sense because what Peter's saying is really what we see Jesus illustrating in Matthew chapter 25. In Matthew chapter 25, if you go read the end of that chapter, you see Jesus dividing people into two different groups, one on his right, one on his left. And to one of those groups, he makes a statement similar to this. I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was in prison, and you visited me. And therefore, kind of enter into the joy of your Lord type of idea in the final judgment. Well, if you take that idea, then you realize that judgment actually happened before then. Because that, while they were alive, that's when they made the decision to feed him, to visit him. And in the same way, those who did not do those things, they made that decision while they were alive, before they stood by him. So this picture that we see here of this test is really that. It's God illustrating, it's God allowing things to happen in the world that illustrate exactly who we are. Are we really for Christ? We're going to act this way. If we're not, we're going to act that way. And so that eschatological judgment, again, is kind of pointing at that whole sense of how we act now in relation to we are in the end times, not in the sense of chronologically, as in it's going to end any moment now, but this is the last era, if you will, biblically speaking. So he goes on. If it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and sinner? Okay, another strange phrase. If the righteous is scarcely saved, we may think, well, are we kind of hanging on by a thread here? No, we're not. And God's power is not minimized to save at all. The scarce ability to save has nothing to do with God's ability to save. So in context of Peter, I think what he's looking at is this. There are going to be many righteous who, due to the trials, turn their back on God. They don't want it. They saw the line. They decided, I don't want to cross that line. This wasn't what I wanted. This wasn't what I expected. I'm turning back. And in that sense, even the righteous are going to scarcely be saved. All of this calls to mind what he says here, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner. If God allows these types of judgment, as we've just described, to happen to his children right now, then we have to recognize this reality. He will judge the ungodly as well. He has made it very clear on that. But thanks be to God who gave us his Son so that we could cling to the author of life in the hopes of our salvation despite sinning. But for those who reject Christ, for those who reject that life that was given to us, the New Testament makes it very clear that they will not have life with God. We need to recognize that because we need to understand the severity of what this truly is. Going into chapter 5, he's going to seem to kind of change ideas a little bit, but the reality is, I think he's still staying in kind of the same context as he starts to wrap up the letter. Starting in verse 1. Peter writes, "So I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility towards one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble." Since this isn't a class on eldership, I won't touch into all of the practical details of this session, but again, try to understand it in the context of Peter's letter. So, why would he bring in the elders here? Well, given the fiery trials that his audience was going to endure, given that situation and those difficulties, I think what he's getting at is that these church leaders, these faithful leaders, would be vitally important for the life, success, and continuation of the church. They're going to have to help members bring sense to all the chaos, to be strengthened when times are difficult, and again, to just be there, to help guide and lead in a way that is godly. So Peter appeals to them as a fellow elder. He relates to them. He's trying to do the same thing. What he's saying is, I'm one of you. And he reminds them as well, and this is such a great reminder for us too, that not only is he a fellow elder, but he's a witness of Jesus' suffering. He's a witness of these things. Now, what does that mean to us? Well, we read it in a book. He watched it. He saw it. He lived it. He saw his teaching. He saw his interaction with people. He witnessed his compassion, his miracles, his crucifixion. He saw him raised to life. Peter appeals to them. From that truth, to care for your members, just like I am for you, and just like ultimately the chief shepherd was doing all along. He had an opportunity to witness for. Now, these leaders were to care for the members because it was their desire, not out of compulsion. Shouldn't not all of our ministries be that way? Shouldn't we develop a love and a heart for God in such a way that causes us to choose to want to engage in ministry and not necessarily, well, I have to do this again, I've got to do that. That doesn't mean it's not work, but hard work is different when it's something that we truly want to do. Hopefully ministry falls into that category. They were to be examples. In other words, they were to live what they taught. A great reminder for all of us. Now, putting this into the Peter's context again, from a practical standpoint, it's hard to imagine exactly what their members faced in regard to all of the circumstances. Did the elders need to act in such a way? Did the shepherds need to act in such a way that needed to calm people down from all that was happening in society? Did they have to deal with divisive relationships because people were trying to say, no, we need to respond this way, no, we need to respond this way? Possibly, probably all of those things. And therefore, they needed to serve exactly like the chief shepherd. And then he goes to one final group. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. So what he's kind of looking at here with be subject to the elders is the idea of following the right protocol, if you will. Be submissive to this situation, follow through. Now, why would that be vitally important for these younger men, these younger people at that time? Well, let's be honest. Are the younger ones more apt, typically, to respond in anger when their honor is potentially trashed, when they're shamed? How might they respond? Is it possible that those with a few more gray hairs might be able to respond in a way that does so with a lower blood pressure? I think so. Again, is that talking about every individual? No, there are exceptions to every rule. But as we age, maybe we develop more patience. Maybe our faith continues to grow. We're able to respond to situations just like Peter addresses, in a Christ-like way, a little bit better. And so he asked them to follow those individuals, follow those elders. Was it going to be hard? Yeah. They were coming into a time that was hard for all of them. But he pleads with them, follow them. So as we wrap up this session, what are our 3 takeaways, once again, that try to leave with you, something you can put in your pocket and remember easily? Well, first of all, suffering for God causes me to choose. I have to make a choice. If I'm living the Christian life, something bad happens to me because of that, I can either stop living that part of the Christian life in order to avoid the bad thing, or I say, no, my Lord is more important than that. I'm on his side no matter what. And if this happens to me because of that, so be it. Sometimes it's easy to blend in. Sometimes it's easy to think, yeah, so I would choose Jesus if I were in that situation until I actually get into that situation. Trials do that. Next time you're faced